Hey, everybody. If you were just enjoying this on the Facebook Live, our internet has gone out, but I do not want to waste the opportunity to teach you a little bit about a pretty amazing car. So we're going to start all over from the beginning. This is one of my favorites. Took a little bit of while to locate it, so I'm not the original owner. But this is a Woods Racing, and it is the X005 Indy Special. Now, if you don't know much about the Woods Racing folks, it was a father-son team. They were based in Sterling Heights, which is basically Detroit, in the mid to late 90s, maybe into the 2000s. Had some incredible drivers that ran for them, like Mark Aldridge and Talbot and some other guys. But they made what was one of the most impressive cars that you could get. This one is a super rare. It's actually an IndyCar version. Now, if we unpack it here, I've got a little bit extra stuff in here. But the first thing is it actually came with its sales receipt. So the Woods car was $150. I don't believe that was the new price. It would have been a more expensive car than that at that time. So I think it was bought used from the Hobby Mart up in Norcross, Georgia. And it looks like they brought some brushes, associated brushes too. And that was in 2000, but it was definitely sold secondhand. That's not the original receipt. Now, in the box with it is probably the greatest radio I think ever made, which was the Magnum PCM 1024. This was kind of the beginning of the modern radios, and we'll get into a little bit of that later into the show. But here it is, the Quaker State number 8. Says it's a Mercedes-Benz on the back, but they didn't run Indy. But let me pull this out, and we'll go through it pretty quickly here. So, one, I want to appreciate everybody who has joined this. I wasn't sure if anybody would have any interest in a bunch of old stuff, but really what I'm trying to do with this broadcast is just give you an idea of race cars in the past, some of the technologies that led into us racing our modern stuff. And this is one of those just amazing cars. So again, you can see this thing was ran just right on the ground. I happen to believe that this one was ran at Major Taylor Velodrome in Indianapolis. They had an IndyCar class, and it's about the right age. And I think I've got a picture of this there. So kind of like all pan cars, it's got the screws holding the body down, and we're just going to take these off and we'll get into some pretty cool stuff here. So let me finish unwrapping that one. The other thing too, this thing's pushing probably 50 ounces. You have to remember this would have had probably right at the end of the Nightcat era, heading into metal halides, and it's got some super cool stuff going on. So let me bring you around and we'll go through it. So one, if you're a Tekin fan, this is actually what would have been a top-notch Tekin. This was the TSC 411G2, and it looks like it's, I think those are some Panasonics. Let's see. Actually, should have looked it up before. Nope, they're Tenergy. And so basically the way that the electronics worked in this, let me give you a view, there you go, is what you would do is you would have, this is a split pack, so you got 2 cells over here, it's a 6-pack, and you have 4 cells over here, and then you're going to take your negative off to this. This is going to go to the negative on your motor, and then you're going to do this kind of kooky deal. Basically what happens is you've got tying these 2 cells together, which is finishing your pack. Then the positive is coming over to the positive on the battery. The positive on the battery then runs directly to the brushed motor. Now, what that means is that this speed control is actually controlling on the negative side because that's what it's braking. And what it was doing, it was basically adjusting down the amount of voltage that the motor would see, and that would give you your speed control. Now, here's another great thing about this car, is you've got standard ball diff. This ball diff, by the way, started with Associated and carries, golly, all the way up till probably about a year or so ago. And then when the black carpet became predominant, a lot of guys started pegging this. But this is actually the same ball diff that they ran for forever. That's going to be an associated buggy shock, and then this is a machined Woods part. Now, some guys would have had this, not a machined part. They would have actually just had a piece of tubing that went to the end of this, and then would have went to here and a nut and everything. But this one had a couple of machined parts on it. And then these are the old Delta shocks on the side. So that big O thing, I mean, just look at it in all its glory, is actually a, let me see, crystal. So this is FM, 75 megahertz FM receiver, and it's got, let's see if I can get it out for crystal, a 64, number 64 in there. So just a really cool kind of piece in time. And then you've got the original 9601 servo. That was the standard servo for pretty much all pan cars in the late 90s. So the tires, these are capped. These are going to be BSR caps. These would have probably not been correct. I think these actually came out right. Maybe they were, but you would have probably had a little bit different tire. These are relatively new. Now, starting from the front to the back, let's get into what they got going on with the suspension. The first thing is you've got these two pieces. This is controlling your caster and your camber. And the caster and the camber basically let you adjust back. If you shorten this one, you can make that one longer, and you can shift the kingpin around inside of there. And what you'll see is that's actually got standard kingpin. Oh, let me focus that a little bit. Kind of a standard king. Oh, it still won't focus. Let's try it one last time, and then I got another idea on how to get in there for it. We'll zoom in on it. So you got right there. Now, like I was saying, so this is standard. That was an associated part, and then your front end, basically you would do spacers just like you would today, and then you've got the same setup in the bottom with the spring. These really were in style for a very short period of time, and what would happen over the next coming, golly, months would be, probably at this time or years, would have been the new associated front end that everybody went to. Now, the reason this had way more of a complex front end, and Woods didn't run it in their other cars, is because they wanted that Indy car look. They also squared the car up with it. So again, just a really cool piece of history. Cars that would have had this would have been, there's actually a Technocraft version that you could get. You could get a variant of this for the Bolink LTO. You could get it for a couple of other cars, but really, really special front end. Now, the bad news is you could screw these things up big time. Talk about needing a hoodie jig, but we didn't have those at that time. You would have had a different setup board, and just an amazing kind of piece there. So let's move to the center of the car. Now again, associated, this is going to be associated. A lot of the parts, as always, are going to come off an associated car. Now, this blue thing is actually the antenna that came out of the body. And then this would have adjusted up and, this would just up and down on the car. Now, what made a Woods car so incredibly special is this rear end setup that they had. And what it is you've got 3 captured balls, and then this bottom T-plate, or the T-plate goes into the top, into the middle, and then you've got a piece that captures it on the top and this bottom plate. Now, what the bottom plate did is it would capture basically the bottom of the ball. So these 3 screws go into, let me move you up. Hard to do. I'm gonna have to get a cameraman. These 3 screws go into the bottom of basically these balls. Then those balls go through the T-plate, and then they're captured on the top. And what it allowed it to do was get independent motion without bending the T-plate. So every car up until these, basically what they would do is they would flex the T-plate, and you would put some tweak in it by basically putting a screw in, and it would adjust the tweak of the rear end. And that's how you put all of the motion in it. These actually used these small points. Now, Hyperdrive had figured this out many years ago. There's an STX. We're going to show that in a couple of future shows. But basically what was happening here is you've got this free movement forward and back, and then you're separating that out with shock. So what we really were able to do is separate in, here's how much dampening I want forward and back, here's how much dampening I want side to side. These shocks would have been short-lived, and folks went to a different shock setup as they evolved. These things leaked like you wouldn't believe. Just absolutely, you almost had to they're completely blown, by the way, out of here. And if we were to open one of these up, what you would see is this shaft actually had a little metal plate on the bottom, and then that would have been pressed on or soldered on. And what would happen, you could pull this along, and it would actually separate off of the shaft, and you wouldn't know it. And then since everything's in tension, it would just stop handling really well. So these were just constant maintenance. Now, to the rear end, this is modified. This is actually, I believe, a modified part from a Tamiya kit, and then you've got the wing. So a couple of other things that are worth noting: fiberglass rear axle on the car, and then you've got the same adjustments. Oops, same adjustments. You would have had a 3-piece here. Now, these were actually machined by Woods. A lot of companies used the Associateds, but these were actually machined by Woods. They used their own Delrin stuff. Now, there's a counter piece. There's a countersunk piece in there, and you can just see it there. That would have been for the Associated parts, but they didn't use them, but you could have. So this, again, you're going to run it. Let me zoom you back out here, and we'll talk a little bit about it just in general. Is you would have ran this car about that close on the ground, and there would have definitely been, this is set up for concrete. So just amazing they were getting away with that. You can see the front end is just extraordinarily stiff, and it's got a couple of green springs in it. Now, this is obviously the problem with running this car so close to the ground. As you can see, just a ton of scratches, which I think, by the way, is super cool. A lot of times you're going to see these cars as, they were shelf queens or something like this, especially one that's in this good a condition. But this car was ran. I don't know if you can see it on here, but these screws are they're ground off. You've got some great cuts into this thing. This car had been ran, and it looks like had been run quite a bit. Like I said, I think it's from Indiana, because it was about the only place that they ran these. And they were, by the way, just an absolute handful. And so when we think about, again, the camera just fell over, kind of the history of where this was. So you're talking about, this is the end of CART, which would be 94, 95. This is by the way, this is the height of what would have been IndyCar, CART. I mean, this was a pretty exciting time for this style of racing. NASCAR was really just coming into being a national sport, and to have a car that looks like this good and just accurately represented it, you've got a few things that are worth kind of noting. One, the front wing, this would have been a road course wing by design, but that would have been insane. You couldn't get enough downforce out of those. Tamiya tried to do that. They actually made a Newman Haas car. They actually made a couple of versions of that. Kyosho also made a car that this would have competed against. But on the raceway, they couldn't compete. Now, I don't know how many of these were actually sold. but it was a really, really low production. In fact, I've only seen 3 of these in my life, and I got fortunate enough to be able to put this one in the racing library. So we'll leave it at that. Next week, we're going to be back. We'll be live, hopefully, if our internet provider allows us to be. We're going to be talking a little bit more about pan cars. We got 4 or 5 that we're going to go through. A couple of things. We're going to talk a lot about Bolinks and kind of their move from the wide car to the narrow car. They also had a Bolink LTO narrow car, which was really kind of the end of their run in pan cars. The 10L, which became the kind of base for 1,000 chassis. We'll talk a little bit about that and the journey that Associated made with that car through the 90s. And then also one of my personal favorites was Hyperdrive. And when they were owned by PTI, which was a military production manufacturer out of Pilot Mountain, North Carolina. They did a ton of batteries, did a bunch of stuff in the hobby. Ralph Birch was the team manager at that time. And they did some really creative things. They were the belt drive cars, if you remember that, if you're old enough to remember that, which probably most of you aren't. And then they created what would have been the predecessor to the ball rear end. They did a pivot ball setup that we're going to really dive into and talk a little bit about. But again, want to keep this short. Wasn't sure how many folks would join. I'm pretty excited to have this car around. If you have any questions, post them up. I'm going to be posting this video in a few minutes since we couldn't do it live. And maybe we'll bring it back next week for some questions and answers. But I really appreciate you joining. This is Sticky Icky Classics. We're going to be talking about some old cars. Take care.